The golden hour is that time of day, around dawn or dusk, when the lighting is often about the best we can expect for our photography, particularly if we're into landscape and seascape photography. We're referring here to the contrast level of the light. With the setting sun often shining through the clouds, the contrast levels are reduced low enough for us to be able to capture a good exposure across the entire scene. The setting sun is often a time when we see more wildlife. It often lights up the contours of the land, giving our images that special something, atmosphere. Around this golden hour, capturing the best quality exposure seems to be a lot easier. We're often working from a tripod, so sharpness is improved too. Image editing is much easier, and we have a greater editing scope too. There seems to be few downsides. The golden hour is not an exact hour, of course, and in some places in the world that so-called hour can stretch to be much longer, but in some places considerably less. I've selected some images we shot recently during an evening in Bateman's Bay, Australia, in what we would all probably agree is the golden hour. To view the images, we can look through the viewfinder of a typical camera together, and the settings we can see displayed, which are pretty typical of digital SLRs, reflect those actually used for these images. Please note, though, that what I'm showing you through my viewfinder are raw images with no image editing done at all. That would defeat the object of the exercise here. But you will see a few finished images too. Now, I've also included the time the image was shot at the top center of the screen, so we can appreciate how quickly things can change over a few minutes. My first image was taken around 1838, probably around 20 minutes before the sun sets, and the contrast range between the highlights and the shadows is pretty good here. The reason for that is the sun is behind enough cloud that its intense contrast is tamed. It's like shining the sun through a giant diffuser, and the result is that the light is soft and appealing. The exposure that I gave here, 125th of a second at f8, all of the images are shot at 100 ISO. It was the exposure suggested by the camera's light meter, and in this case I think that's about right. So with my first shot, or the first shot that I'm showing you, I think I've got a reasonable demonstration that the soft golden hour light makes exposure easier. Here we are 2 minutes later at 1840, and the sun is about to drop out of that bank of cloud. The exposure is identical to the previous image, although I have used different settings. Here I've used a 60th of a second at f11, but that is equivalent of the previous 125th of a second at f8. Now, the effect of those 2 minutes in time are minimal on the image, but we can begin to see more of that intense sunlight beginning to creep through. In this next shot, which is one of 3 taken at the same time, we're now 13 minutes later at 1853, and the sun is now very strong because it's dropped out of that cloud. Now, this is an interesting shot from an exposure point of view. The sky is very light here, but that's because my composition uses 2/3 of the sand at the bottom and just 1/3 of the sky at the top. The darker tones of the beach are influencing the exposure. What I'm doing here is exposing more for the shadows, and while the bottom half of the image is very well exposed, the top half is overexposed. This is the next in that sequence of 3 shots taken at 1853. But I've used exposure compensation and given the shot 2 stops less exposure. We can see that by the yellow marker on the right hand side, dropping to that -2 location. The previous shot had a 15th of a second at f11. This one was given a 60th at f11, which is 2 stops. Could we work with this image in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom? Yes, I think we can. The exposure is a little bit of a compromise, but we can lighten the foreground and darken the sky, and the small area of highlight around the sun, I think under the circumstances would be acceptable. Now we come to the third of those 3 images shot at 1853, and this one has 3 stops less exposure than our first. And I think we could now argue that the exposure has drifted to a point where a comfortable manipulation for this image would be more difficult, and it would probably affect the quality too. We can see that the sky is lovely, but the shadows are beginning to block up, and we know that getting detail from dark shadows is much harder than darkening a lighter sky. It's now 19:06, 13 minutes later, and the sun has just dipped below the horizon. We can now see how that is reflected in the lower light levels, and we now need a 60th of a second at f8 to record a balanced exposure. You can see that the exposure used was that which the camera suggested, by the exposure marker being on the center on the right hand side. So the camera decided that this was the correct exposure, and I think it probably is. But now this is a crucial time, because right about now, a few minutes after the sun has gone, the amateur photographers are already loading their gear back in the car and driving away. Big mistake. It's now 19:10, and we can see lower light levels and a further softening of the light. We now need to stop more exposure than the previous image, even though we're only 4 minutes later in time. The exposure here is pretty good. In fact, we have pretty good composition. We have good foreground interest to add depth to the seascape. The exposure is virtually at the midday point on my exposure clock. In an ideal world, a little less exposure in the sky and maybe a tiny bit more on the rocks would be nice. But can we work with an image like this? I think so, pretty easily. So let's take a look at a manipulation of this shot. So we can see here that the exposure has allowed us to do our work on the sky, but retain detail in some of the darkest areas of the image. 4 minutes later, at 19:14, those photographers that left too early are probably queuing up for their takeaway supper. We are still capturing great images. Lower and softer light is what we see here, requiring yet another stop of exposure from the previous image. Now we're well into what I call tripod territory here at a 15th of a second shutter speed, but we've been using the tripod throughout the shoot for convenience, speed of work, and of course sharp, well-focused images. Can we work on this image? Yes, we can easily manipulate this image in Photoshop or Lightroom because the exposure was about the best I think we could have hoped to have got. Good detail throughout the shadows, so we are in control. So here we're just 2 minutes later again at 19:16. 15th of a second at f8, and the camera is getting the exposure pretty good. Even the basic unmanipulated thumbnail here looks better, both here and it would have looked a lot better on the camera's LCD too. Image editing will be easier, but now I am beginning to think of exposing to the right. This image was taken at the same time, but it's been given an extra stop of exposure, so we've doubled the amount of light falling on the sensor. We've given it an eighth of a second at f8, and we can see that exposure marker reflecting the fact that I stepped in and compensated for the exposure. Why did I do that? The simple answer is because I can. I can do that without doing any damage elsewhere. I can make the rocks lighter, but without that impacting on the sky. Sure, it makes the sky lighter too, but that's easily darkened. The lighter rocks give me scope. Perhaps I want them solid black, perhaps I don't. At least now I have some choice. As you can see with the result here, I can easily create this image either in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. So while the light remains this good, I really can't fail. Later, when I get the thumbnails on the PC, it's not a search for the odd image to process. I've got so many, it's a dilemma on which ones I should pick. I have the freedom to now pick those that work visually better or simply appeal to me more. Here we are 5 minutes later at 1921, and I can expose even more to the right if I wish to. Here we have +2 stops increase for a 1 second at f11 exposure. The picture looks a little light, but then we have exposed well to the right, and there's no detail we will lose here at all. Another 5 minutes at 1926 and I've been able to slow the shutter speed to 8 seconds, reduce the aperture to f22, and now I'm in control of both exposure and the movement in the water. You'll notice here that I'm still exposing to the right by 1 stop, so I'm not losing any shadow detail at all, even at this late time in the evening. So here the golden hour has allowed us to present a top quality image where the manipulation was pretty quick and easy to do. Photoshop often gets labelled as the software to fix problems that you should have got right when you press the shutter button. Now there's no doubt that in the right hands it can do wonders at times, but if it can do that, think what it can do when we start the process with great exposures and the contrast tamed by a little thought. Now I've presented so far just a few of the images I shot that evening. The first shot was taken at 1833, about 30 minutes before sunset. 148 images were shot in total. The last was taken at 1928, so we were there, in fact, almost an hour. Now let me show the images I've manipulated from that evening, and I've included the time up top so we can track the golden hour. So here we're around about half hour before sunset. But if you get to a place and the sun is behind the clouds, of course you can start shooting, because we've got the effect we're looking for here. The sun is subdued and we've got soft, even light, and a bit of colour too. 1837, 20 odd minutes before sunset. The sun still hasn't dropped out of that bank of cloud to stop play for a little while, and we can capture some images while we wait. And one of the amazing things when you're in a situation like this, or anywhere come to that, pick up your tripod and walk 20 yards one way or 20 yards the other way, and you'll be amazed at the difference in the images you're shooting. So go for variety as well as quality. Still well before sunset, but what I've done here, I've taken 3 separate exposures and I've used all 3 to squeeze as much quality and impact from the shot as I can. Now here, as you can see, the sun has dropped out of the cloud. Still hasn't set yet, it's got about another 6 minutes to go. But of course what we've now got is that interesting light, where the low sun is picking up all of that detail on the beach and almost making it look like nuggets of gold sitting up there. So although we're in a tricky situation, we need to be able to capture a shot and to exploit it as best we can in our image editor. This image I did show earlier alongside the original, and as you can see by the time, the sun has now set and now the colours start to come up. This is one of my favourites, and even though it's my image, I think it's a pretty strong image from a quality point of view, composition point of view, and of course exposure and interest too. Variety is the spice of life, they say, so as I said earlier on, I'm often picking up the tripod, and this is why it's great to have the camera on it. The camera bag's on my back, so I can quickly stride away 20-30 yards and get sometimes completely different viewpoints. It is nice to be able to shoot straight into the sunset like this, to capture the colour but still have detail in the rocks. So many times when we see images like this posted on the internet, all of those rocks would be pure black. 19:22 now, 22 minutes roughly since the sun's gone down, but of course if you were there at the time shooting images it seems almost like no time at all. And we've got the added bonus that the moon has made an appearance too. And finally, of course, we do reach a point where we've got the freedom to be able to manipulate any shutter speed and aperture we want to capture movement in the water, if that's what we need. And of course, we don't need any neutral density filters to do this. Don't get too obsessed with looking at the sunset. From time to time, look behind you. This was a time when I was on a beach down in Melbourne, and the sun's going down behind me now, and it wasn't that impressive. And I turned to walk back, and lo and behold, there's the moon sitting just above the trees. I had no idea it was about to appear, so I quickly snapped a couple of shots. I was a little bit disappointed I couldn't get the moon in a more compositionally strong position, but these things happen when you least expect them. And a different interpretation of the same evening. This was taken in a seaside town close to where I live called Caloundra, and I was with a friend who wanted to photograph the sun going down over the Glasshouse Mountains, which are completely behind us. Well, that didn't pan out too well, and I looked the other way, and there we have a pretty good shot. I love the light on the rocks down there. The clouds, even though they're way out in the east, they're picking up the light from the dying sun. And of course, as the sun is rising or sinking, and it's at a very low level, some very ordinary subjects suddenly become pretty spectacular. Now, I didn't see the insect hovering there when I took this shot. I was just attracted by the light coming through the leaves and the blossoms. The golden hour can also have other benefits, because I didn't expect to see these guys when I arrived at this location. But I guess they're trying to make use of the cooler morning air, so they're not affected too much by thermals, and because the sun is very low, they tend to be lit very nicely. Perfect for us photographers. Again, another shot where we just had to be in the right place at the right time, but you don't plan things like this. The sunset didn't pan out very well at all, although the sun did set, as you can see. But then this aluminium boat heads to the boat ramp and gives us the opportunity for a good shot. End of the day, fleeting light. That's when the light becomes special. The changing light makes exposure tricky at times, but of course if we're photographing at dawn or dusk, that does tend to level the playing field just a bit towards our favour. So here we're on the east coast, looking east when the sun is setting. So we had no intention here of actually photographing the sun go down. What we were looking for was the soft light that the golden hour gives, and I think we achieved it here. And with this image too, because I think this was at the same location. And once again, because of the low light levels, I've now got the advantage of being able to allow water movement if I wish to. Now, very often the best time to take night shots like this are just around dusk, and that's when this was taken. The sun has just set, and we've got the benefit of light in the sky, a bit of cloud, and the lights of the bridge just coming up. An image that's completely different to many of the others I've shown, but it was taken in the golden hour one evening looking eastwards. Hardly any colour in the sky, just enough to add something, and it's that lovely soft light and the movement in the water which gives the image some appeal. I'm not a dedicated or an experienced bird photographer, but if there's one thing I've learned is I get much better images in the morning and in the evening around that golden hour, when the birds seem to be active, either just arising for the day or just about to roost for the day, and that is when I've seemed to be able to capture the best images. Now, sometimes I think the hardest part of photography is being at the right place at the right time. Mother Nature doesn't always turn on the colour every dawn or dusk, but she does give us some unique lighting most of the time, and that is going to help us enormously, both from an interest in the image content, but also in the exposure, what we're able to capture, and what we're able to manipulate in our image editor. Going out to shoot at dawn or dusk will increase your photographic opportunities. That I can guarantee, because we tend to see more wildlife, birds of prey, things like that around that sort of hour. But the object of the exercise here is to demonstrate that exposure is the be-all and end-all for photographers. When we can get the exposure well balanced, as I hope we've demonstrated here, the image editing becomes easier, the quality gets better, and our satisfaction gets better too.